The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and I knew it was trouble the moment I saw the return address from Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'm Samuel Atwood, and I'd been living in this neighborhood for 3 years without a single problem until 6 months ago when Barbara Henderson took over as HOA president. My wife Jenny had warned me that things were about to change when Barbara won the election, but I figured how bad could it really be? Turns out, pretty bad. I opened the letter standing in my driveway, the Arizona sun beating down on my shoulders. Inside was a notice of violation and a fine for $250. The reason? Storing building materials visible from the street, specifically a stack of plywood sheets leaning against the side of my garage. According to the letter, this violated Section 4.7 of the HOA covenants regarding unsightly storage of construction materials. The thing is, those plywood sheets weren't just randomly stored there. I'd carefully placed them in a designated storage area that I'd built specifically to code, following every regulation in the Scottsdale building guidelines. I'm a contractor by trade, running my own business for 15 years, and I know the codes inside and out. That plywood was for a client project I was working on, and I'd needed to store it temporarily at my house because the lumber yard had delivered early. I walked back inside and found Jenny in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked up when she heard me come in, and her expression changed when she saw my face. "Let me guess," she said, setting down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "Another letter from the HOA." I handed it to her without a word. She read it quickly, her eyebrows rising higher with each sentence. $250 for storing plywood. That's insane. You just put that there 3 days ago. Exactly. And it's not like I threw it in a pile in the front yard. It's properly stored, secured, and completely up to code. I built that storage area myself after checking with the city about what was allowed. Jenny put the letter down on the counter and crossed her arms. "You need to fight this. Barbara's been on a power trip ever since she became president. Did you hear what she did to the Mitchells 2 doors down? Fined them for having their trash cans visible for more than 12 hours before pickup." I had heard about that, along with several other ridiculous violations Barbara had issued in recent months. She'd become notorious in the neighborhood for driving around with a clipboard, looking for any minor infraction she could find. The woman had too much time on her hands and seemed to get some kind of satisfaction from making other people's lives difficult. "I'm definitely fighting it," I said. "I'll go to the next HOA meeting and explain the situation. This is ridiculous." But the HOA meeting was 2 weeks away, and the letter stated that if I didn't pay the fine within 10 days or remove the offending materials, the fine would double. I wasn't about to pay for something I hadn't done wrong, but I also couldn't move the plywood yet. It was expensive marine-grade material that my client had specifically ordered for a custom outdoor project, and moving it back and forth unnecessarily could damage it. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. I called the City of Scottsdale Building Department and asked to speak to a building inspector. After explaining my situation, they scheduled an inspection for the following day. I figured if I could get an official city inspector to confirm that my storage setup was completely legal and up to code, the HOA would have to back down. The inspector who showed up was a man named Robert Chen, who I'd actually worked with before on various projects around Scottsdale. He was thorough, fair, and knew the building codes better than anyone I'd ever met. "Samuel," he said, shaking my hand as he arrived. "What's this I hear about HOA trouble?" I showed him the letter and then walked him around to the side of my garage where the plywood was stored. I'd built a covered storage area with proper ventilation, secured the sheets with appropriate strapping, and kept everything well away from property lines and utility access points. Robert pulled out his measuring tape and spent about 20 minutes examining everything. He took photos, made notes on his tablet, and checked the positioning against the property survey markers. Finally, he turned to me with an approving nod. "Samuel, I've got to tell you, this is one of the better storage setups I've seen in a residential area. You're not just following code here, you're exceeding it. This covered area you built prevents water damage, the ventilation stops moisture buildup, and the way you've secured these sheets is actually safer than what most contractors do. If anything, the HOA should be using this as an example of how to properly store materials." "Can you put that in writing?" I asked. "Absolutely. I'll write up a formal inspection report. You're in full compliance with all city codes, and there's nothing in Scottsdale municipal regulations that would prohibit what you're doing here. Now, your HOA might have their own rules, but those can't supersede city code when it comes to safety and proper storage." He typed up the report right there on his tablet and emailed it to me before he left. I printed out 3 copies as soon as I got back inside. Armed with this official documentation, I felt confident that the HOA would have to withdraw the fine. I should have known better. That afternoon, I drafted a formal response to the HOA, included a copy of the inspection report, and delivered it personally to Barbara Henderson's house. She lived 4 streets over in one of the larger homes in the development, a 2-story Mediterranean-style place with an immaculate front yard that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Barbara answered the door wearing yoga pants and a designer top, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She was in her mid-40s, and everything about her demeanor screamed, "I need to speak to the manager." "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone already defensive even though I hadn't said a word yet. "Hi, Barbara. I'm Samuel Atwood from Sagaro Drive. I received a violation notice about storing plywood, and I wanted to provide you with this inspection report from the city building department. It confirms that my storage setup is completely up to code and legal." She took the envelope from me without looking at it. "HOA covenants are separate from city codes, Mr. Atwood. Just because something is technically legal doesn't mean it's appropriate for our community standards. But the building inspector said I'm actually exceeding code requirements. The plywood is only there temporarily for a client project." "How long is temporary?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most. Our covenants don't allow for storage of commercial materials on residential property. If you're running a business, you should rent commercial storage space." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. I'm a contractor, yes, but I'm not running a business out of my home. This is just temporary storage for a single project. Plenty of people in the neighborhood have work materials at their houses. I've seen other contractors here, landscapers, even the guy 3 streets over who has a plumbing van in his driveway every day. "If you see other violations, you're welcome to report them," Barbara said coldly. "But that doesn't excuse your violation. The fine stands. You have 10 days to remove the materials or pay." She closed the door before I could respond. I stood there for a moment, staring at the ornate wreath hanging on her door, wondering how someone could be so unreasonable. This wasn't about protecting property values or maintaining community standards. This was about power and control. When I got home and told Jenny about the conversation, she wasn't surprised. "I told you she wouldn't back down." She's made it her personal mission to enforce every tiny rule in those covenants. Last month, she threatened the Patels with a fine because their daughter drew hopscotch squares on their driveway with chalk that washes away with water. This is getting out of hand, I said. There has to be something we can do. Jenny pulled out her laptop. Let me look at the covenants again. Maybe there's something we're missing. We spent the evening going through the HOA documents line by line. The covenants were 73 pages long, written in dense legal language that made my eyes hurt. But buried in section 4.7, we found something interesting. The provision about storing building materials specified that such materials couldn't be stored in plain view from the street for extended periods. The key word was extended. Nowhere in the documents did it define what extended meant. 1 week, 1 month, 1 year. The ambiguity was significant. This might be your angle, Jenny said, pointing at the screen. The covenant doesn't define extended periods, and you have documentation that this is temporary storage for an active project. She was right. I drafted another letter to the HOA, this time citing the specific language in the covenants, and arguing that 3 weeks didn't constitute an extended period for temporary project storage. I also requested a formal hearing before the HOA board, which was my right according to the governing documents. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7, held in the clubhouse near the neighborhood pool. I arrived 15 minutes early with my folder full of documentation. The building inspector's report, photos of my storage setup, my client contract showing the project timeline, and copies of the relevant covenant sections with my interpretation highlighted. The clubhouse was a small building with a community room that could hold maybe 50 people. Tonight, there were about 20 residents scattered throughout the folding chairs, most of them looking bored or resigned. I recognized a few neighbors but didn't know many of them well. Our neighborhood was one of those places where people mostly kept to themselves, which probably explained how Barbara had been able to consolidate so much power without much pushback. Barbara sat at a table in the front with 4 other board members. I recognized 2 of them. Gerald Martinez, an older retired gentleman who always seemed half asleep at these meetings, and Patricia Wheeler, a woman in her 60s who I'd heard was actually fairly reasonable but had been steamrolled by Barbara's aggressive leadership style. The meeting started with the usual boring procedural stuff. They approved the minutes from the last meeting, discussed the budget for pool maintenance, and debated whether to replace the landscaping at the neighborhood entrance. I sat through it all, waiting for my chance to speak. Finally, after about 40 minutes, Barbara looked down at her agenda and said, "We have a request for a hearing regarding a violation notice issued to Samuel Atwood of 2847 Sagaro Drive. Mr. Atwood, would you like to address the board?" I stood up and walked to the front, feeling everyone's eyes on me. I wasn't nervous, exactly. I'd presented to clients and building officials plenty of times in my career, but there was something about the hostile way Barbara was looking at me that put me on edge. "Thank you for hearing me tonight," I began. "I'm here to contest the violation notice I received regarding plywood storage at my property. I've brought several pieces of documentation that I think will clarify the situation." I handed out copies of everything to the board members and then launched into my explanation. I walked them through the building inspector's report, emphasizing that a city official had specifically stated I was exceeding code requirements. I showed them the photos proving that the materials were properly stored, not just thrown in a pile. I explained the temporary nature of the storage and showed them my client contract with the project timeline. The covenant language says materials can't be stored in plain view for extended periods, I concluded. My storage is temporary, professional, and actually safer than what the city requires. 3 weeks isn't an extended period. It's a reasonable time frame for an active construction project. I'm respectfully requesting that the board withdraw this violation and the associated fine." Gerald seemed to be nodding along with my presentation, and Patricia was reading through the building inspector's report with interest. But Barbara's expression hadn't changed at all. "Thank you, Mr. Atwood," she said flatly. "Does anyone on the board have questions?" Patricia raised her hand. "I have to say, this inspection report is pretty compelling. If the city says he's following proper procedures, shouldn't that carry weight?" "City code and HOA covenants are two separate things," Barbara said quickly. "We're not here to rubber stamp whatever the city approves. We're here to maintain the aesthetic standards of this community. And having commercial materials visible from the street negatively impacts our property values." "But it's not visible from the street," I interjected. "It's on the side of my garage. You'd have to deliberately walk onto my property or into my driveway to see it." Barbara pulled out her phone and swiped through some photos. "I have pictures here taken from the sidewalk that clearly show your plywood stack." She passed the phone around. I leaned over to look when it reached Patricia, and I had to stop myself from laughing. Barbara had obviously stood at the very edge of the sidewalk, angled herself at a specific position, and zoomed in with her camera to get a shot that barely showed the edge of one plywood sheet. It was ridiculous. "That's really reaching," Patricia said, echoing my thoughts. "You can see maybe 6 inches of material in this photo, and only from one very specific angle." "The covenant says visible from the street," Barbara insisted. "It doesn't specify how visible." The debate went on for another 20 minutes. Gerald asked a few sleepy questions about whether this would set a precedent for other residents. Patricia kept pushing back on Barbara's interpretation, arguing that the board needed to be reasonable in their enforcement. The other 2 board members, who I learned were named Donald and Christine, mostly stayed quiet but seemed to lean toward Barbara's position. Finally, Barbara called for a vote on whether to uphold or withdraw the violation. 3 board members voted to uphold it, including Barbara. Patricia voted to withdraw it, and Gerald abstained, saying he needed more time to think about the implications. "The violation stands," Barbara announced with barely concealed satisfaction. "You have until Friday of next week to remove the materials or pay the fine. If the materials are still there after Friday, the fine will double to $500. I felt my jaw clench. This is completely unreasonable. I've proven that I'm following proper procedures and that the storage is temporary. "You're welcome to appeal to the board again after 30 days, Barbara said. "But the violation stands for now. Is there any other new business?" She moved on to the next agenda item without waiting for my response. I gathered my papers and walked out of the clubhouse, too frustrated to sit through the rest of the meeting. Several residents followed me out, including Patricia. "I'm sorry, Samuel," she said quietly. "I tried, but Barbara has Donald and Christine wrapped around her finger. Gerald's useless. He votes however she tells him to most of the time." "How did she get so much power?" I asked. Patricia sighed. "Most people don't pay attention to HOA elections. Barbara ran unopposed because nobody else wanted the job. Now she treats it like she's running a corporation instead of a neighborhood association. She's been driving good people out of this community with her petty enforcement. There has to be something we can do. Can't we call for a vote of no confidence or something?" "Technically, yes. But you'd need to get 20% of homeowners to sign a petition calling for a special election. That's about 50 households. It's not easy to organize that many people, especially when most of them just want to be left alone." We talked for a few more minutes before Patricia had to leave. I sat in my truck in the parking lot, trying to decide what to do next. I could move the plywood, but that felt like giving in to a bully. I could pay the fine, but that would be admitting I'd done something wrong when I hadn't. Or I could let the fine double and take this to the next level. When I got home, Jenny was waiting up for me. I filled her in on everything that happened at the meeting. "I'm not moving the plywood," I said. "And I'm definitely not paying the fine. If they want to double it, let them. We'll see what happens when this gets escalated." "Are you sure?" Jenny asked. $500 is a lot of money. It's not about the money anymore, it's about the principle. Barbara is abusing her power and somebody needs to stand up to her. If not me, then who? Jenny thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'm with you. What's the plan?" "I'm going to talk to a lawyer, find out what our options are if this keeps escalating, and maybe look into that petition idea Patricia mentioned." The next morning, I called a real estate attorney that I'd worked with on a few commercial projects. His name was David Stern, and he had an office in downtown Scottsdale. He agreed to see me that afternoon. David's office was in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive artwork on the walls. He greeted me warmly and offered me coffee before we sat down to discuss the situation. "HOA disputes," he said with a slight smile after I'd explained everything. "I probably handle 2 or 3 of these a month. They're becoming more common as HOA boards get more aggressive with enforcement." "So what are my options?" I asked. "Well, you have a few paths forward. First, you can continue fighting within the HOA structure. Request another hearing, file formal complaints, maybe even run for the board yourself in the next election. Second, you can pay the fine under protest and then sue the HOA in civil court to recover your money and legal fees. Third, you can simply refuse to pay and force the HOA to take legal action, at which point you defend yourself in court. What do you recommend?" David leaned back in his chair. "Given what you've told me, especially with the building inspector's report, I think you have a strong case. The covenant language about extended periods is vague enough that a judge would likely side with your interpretation over the HOA's, particularly with expert testimony from a building inspector. The problem is, litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Even if you win, it could take months or even years to resolve. What if we organize residents to vote Barbara out? That's actually your best option if you can pull it off. It's faster and cheaper than litigation, and it addresses the root cause of the problem rather than just this one issue. But like your neighbor told you, organizing that many people isn't easy." We discussed the specifics for another 30 minutes. David agreed to draft a formal letter to the HOA board outlining the legal weaknesses in their position and advising them that I would pursue litigation if necessary. He also gave me some guidance on how to organize a petition for a special election. I left his office feeling more prepared, but also aware of the long road ahead. This wasn't going to be resolved quickly or easily. Over the next few days, I started talking to neighbors. I went door to door in the evenings, introducing myself to people I'd never met and explaining what was happening with the HOA. The responses were mixed. Some people were sympathetic but didn't want to get involved. "I just want to live my life without drama," one neighbor told me. Others had their own horror stories about Barbara's enforcement actions. The Patels told me about the chalk incident in detail, including how Barbara had threatened to fine them $50 per day until the chalk was removed. A retired couple 3 streets over had been fined for having the wrong color flowers in their front yard, apparently violating some provision about approved landscaping pallets. But getting people to sign a petition was harder than just getting them to commiserate. Many were afraid of retaliation. "If I sign this and she stays in power, she'll make my life hell," more than one person told me. Others simply didn't care enough. "It's not worth my time to fight the HOA," they said. By the end of the week, I'd managed to get 15 signatures. I needed 50. At this rate, it would take me a month just to gather enough support, and in the meantime, the doubled fine deadline was approaching. Friday came, and I still hadn't moved the plywood. I'd sent David's letter to the HOA board earlier in the week, and I was hoping it might prompt some reconsideration. It didn't. Friday afternoon, another certified letter arrived with a new violation notice and a bill for $500. This time, the letter also included a threat. If I didn't pay within 10 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property. They also added a new violation for continued non-compliance with board directives and tacked on an additional $200 fine. $700 total now. For storing plywood properly and safely on my own property, Jenny was livid when she saw the letter. They're out of control. This is harassment at this point. I know, but we knew this was coming. David said to expect escalation. I called David immediately and forwarded him the new letter. He called me back within an hour. They're moving faster than I expected, he said. The threat of a lien is serious. If they actually place one on your property, it could affect your ability to sell or refinance. But here's the thing, they have to follow proper procedures to place a lien. They can't just do it arbitrarily. There's a process, and it usually takes at least 60 days from the initial violation. So we have time, some. But Samuel, I think you need to consider whether this fight is worth it. $700 is significant, but it's not catastrophic. Sometimes the practical choice is to pay the fine and move on with your life. If I pay this, what's to stop them from doing the same thing next time? Or from doing it to other people in the neighborhood? Someone has to stand up to them. David was quiet for a moment. I understand the principle. And you're right that this behavior needs to be challenged. But you should go into this with your eyes open about what it might cost you, both financially and in terms of stress. I appreciate the warning, but I'm not backing down. We talked through the next steps. David would file a formal response to the new violation notice, again outlining the legal problems with the HOA's position. He'd also draft a cease and desist letter, warning the board that their actions were starting to constitute harassment. In the meantime, I would continue gathering signatures for the petition. That weekend, I printed out flyers explaining the situation and posted them on the community Facebook page. I also distributed them to every mailbox in the neighborhood. The response was bigger than I expected. My phone started ringing Saturday afternoon. Other residents who'd had problems with Barbara called to share their stories. Some offered to help with the petition. A few even said they'd be willing to run for the board if we could force a special election. By Sunday evening, I had 40 signatures. We were getting close. Monday morning, I got a call from Robert Chen, the building inspector who'd examined my property. Samuel, I heard about what's happening with your HOA. Word gets around in the building department. I wanted to let you know that if this ends up in court, I'd be willing to testify on your behalf. What they're doing is absurd, and it actually undermines proper building practices. If homeowners are discouraged from properly storing materials because of overzealous HOA enforcement, they might start using unsafe methods instead. I really appreciate that, Robert. It might come to that. There's something else you should know. I did some digging into your HOA's history with the building department. Over the past year, we've received 3 complaints from Meadowbrook Heights HOA about residents supposedly violating building codes. In every case, we investigated and found no violations. It seems like your HOA president might be trying to use the city to enforce her personal preferences. That was interesting. Did you document those complaints? Everything's on record. Public information. You could request copies if you need them for your case. I thanked Robert and immediately called David to tell him about this development. He agreed it could be useful evidence showing a pattern of harassment if we ended up in litigation. The week moved quickly. I continued gathering signatures while also working on my client projects. The plywood stayed exactly where it was, properly secured and protected. I took dated photos every day to document that nothing about the storage situation had changed or degraded. Wednesday evening, I finally hit my goal. 53 signatures on the petition calling for a special election to recall the HOA board. According to the governing documents, I now needed to submit this to the board, and they would have 30 days to schedule the election. I printed out the official petition on Thursday morning and hand-delivered it to Barbara's house that afternoon. This time, I brought a witness, my neighbor Frank, who'd been one of the first people to sign the petition. Barbara answered the door looking like she'd been expecting me, which she probably had been given all the activity in the neighborhood over the past week. "Miss Henderson, I'm here to formally submit a petition calling for a special election to recall the board. This petition has 53 valid signatures from homeowners in Meadowbrook Heights, which exceeds the 20% threshold required by our governing documents." I held out the petition. She didn't take it at first, just stared at me with barely contained anger. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "This neighborhood needs strong leadership to maintain property values. If you think things will be better with a weak board that lets everyone do whatever they want, you're wrong. This isn't about weak leadership. It's about fair and reasonable enforcement of the rules. You've been abusing your position and the residents have had enough." She finally took the petition, glanced at the signatures, and then looked back at me. "Fine. I'll submit this to the board. We'll schedule a meeting to validate the signatures and discuss next steps, but you should know that many of these people will lose their nerve when it comes time to actually vote. Talk is cheap." "We'll see," I said. Frank and I walked back down her driveway. "That went better than expected," he said. "I thought she might slam the door in your face. She's too smart for that. She knows she has to follow procedures or it'll make her position even weaker." The board meeting to validate the petition was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Jenny and I attended, along with about 40 other residents, the most I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. Barbara called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the petition. She'd clearly been preparing for this. "Before we validate these signatures, I want to note for the record that this recall effort was initiated by a resident who is currently in violation of HOA covenants and facing significant fines. There's an obvious conflict of interest here." Patricia, the board member who'd supported me at the previous meeting, spoke up. "That's not relevant to the validity of the petition. If he has the required number of legitimate signatures from homeowners, we're obligated to proceed with an election." "I'm simply noting it for the record," Barbara said tersely. They went through the signatures one by one, verifying each one against the homeowner registry. It took over an hour, but in the end, all 53 signatures were validated. Several were from people in the room who stood up and confirmed their support for the recall. "Very well," Barbara said, her voice tight. "According to our bylaws, the special election must be held within 30 days of petition validation. We'll schedule it for Saturday, March 15th, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. at this clubhouse. Now, we need to open the floor for board nominations." This was the critical part. We couldn't just recall the existing board without having candidates ready to replace them. I'd been recruiting people all week, making sure we had enough willing to serve. Frank stood up first. "I nominate myself for a board position." Patricia stood next. I'd like to continue serving if the residents will have me. 3 other residents also nominated themselves, people I'd vetted over the past week. They were reasonable, level-headed homeowners who understood the need for rules, but also the importance of fair enforcement. Barbara and her allies also nominated themselves for re-election, as expected. The ballot would have 11 candidates for 5 board positions, making it a genuine election rather than just a straight recall. Over the next 3 weeks, our neighborhood became consumed by HOA politics. Campaign flyers appeared in mailboxes. People held meet and greet sessions in their backyards. The community Facebook page was filled with debates about what kind of leadership the HOA needed. Barbara's campaign focused on maintaining standards and protecting property values. She sent out glossy mailers with photos of well-maintained homes and statistics about home prices in Meadowbrook Heights compared to other Scottsdale neighborhoods. Our side focused on reasonable enforcement and community over compliance. We shared stories of residents who'd been hit with unfair fines and argued that the HOA should serve homeowners, not the other way around. Throughout all of this, my plywood stayed exactly where it was. I'd finished the client project and actually had a legitimate reason to move it now, but I left it there as a symbol. Several neighbors put up signs in their yards saying, "Vote for fair enforcement," with a small picture of my plywood stack. It became a rallying point for the campaign. Barbara sent me 2 more violation notices during this period, each adding more fines. I was up to $1,200 in alleged violations now. David sent formal responses to each one, denying any wrongdoing and stating that all fines would be contested in court if necessary. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. I had people honking and waving at me when I drove through the streets, showing support. But I also had people glaring at me or pointedly looking away. The neighborhood was divided. Election day finally arrived. Jenny and I showed up at the clubhouse at 8 a.m. sharp to vote and then stayed to observe the process. A steady stream of residents came throughout the day. Some looked uncomfortable, hurrying in and out quickly. Others stayed to chat, discussing the election and what they hoped would change. By 7 p.m., the line was out the door as last-minute voters rushed to cast their ballots. Barbara was there, sitting at a table in the corner, watching everyone who came in with a fixed smile on her face. At 8 p.m. sharp, the voting closed. 3 neutral residents who'd volunteered as election officials began counting the ballots by hand while about 30 of us watched. It took almost 2 hours to count everything and verify the results. The election official, a retired accountant named Margaret who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, stood up to announce the results. For the 5 board positions, the results are as follows. Patricia Wheeler received 187 votes. Frank Morrison received 172 votes. Samuel Atwood received 164 votes. Wait, what? I'd been nominated at the last minute but hadn't seriously campaigned for a board position myself. I'd been too focused on organizing the recall, Margaret continued. Maria Santos received 156 votes, and Thomas Payne received 151 votes. Those 5 individuals constitute the new HOA board. Barbara Henderson received 142 votes, along with Donald Grant at 138 and Christine Liu at 129. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Barbara stood up abruptly, her face red, and walked out without saying a word. Her 2 allies followed her quickly. I was stunned. Not only had we successfully recalled the old board, but I'd somehow been elected to replace them. Jenny hugged me, laughing. "Congratulations, board member Atwood," she said. "I guess you're really committed to fixing this now." The 5 newly elected board members stayed late that night, talking about our priorities. Patricia would continue as president, which everyone agreed made sense given her experience. Frank would be vice president. I volunteered to be treasurer, figuring my business background would be useful there. Our first order of business as a board, we decided, would be reviewing all outstanding violations and fines to determine which ones were legitimate and which ones were examples of overreach. My case was near the top of that list. The following week, we held our first official board meeting as the new leadership. About 50 residents attended, wanting to see what the new board would do differently. Patricia called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. One of our first priorities is reviewing enforcement actions taken over the past year. We've identified several cases where fines may have been issued inappropriately, or where the board may have been overly strict in its interpretation of our covenants. We'll be reviewing each case individually and making decisions about whether to uphold, reduce, or eliminate those fines. She looked directly at me. To avoid any conflict of interest, Samuel has recused himself from voting on his own case. The other 4 board members will make that decision. They'd already reviewed my situation in detail before the meeting. Frank presented the findings to the full room, including the building inspector's report, the photos of my storage setup, and the timeline showing it had been temporary storage for an active project, which I'd completed 2 weeks earlier. Given the documentation and the temporary nature of the storage, we believe the original violation was issued in error, Frank said. We're voting to withdraw all violations and fines related to this case. The vote was unanimous among the 4 voting members. Just like that, $1,200 in fines vanished. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying. But we weren't done. Over the next 2 hours, the board reviewed 15 other cases. We eliminated fines against the Patels for the chalk incident. We withdrew violations against 3 residents who'd been fined for minor landscaping issues that didn't actually violate any covenants. We reduced fines in several cases where violations were legitimate, but the penalties had been excessive. By the end of the meeting, we'd eliminated over $8,000 in fines across the neighborhood. Several residents had tears in their eyes as they thanked us. One older woman named Dorothy approached me after the meeting. "You don't know what this means," she said. "I'm on a fixed income, and I couldn't afford the $500 fine they hit me with for having a crack in my driveway. I was going to have to choose between paying that and buying my medications next month. Thank you for fighting this." That's when I really understood what we'd accomplished. This wasn't just about my plywood or even about standing up to Barbara's power trip. It was about protecting people in our community who couldn't fight back against an abusive system. Over the next few months, we worked to reform the HOA's practices. We rewrote the enforcement procedures to include a warning system before any fines were issued. We created an appeals process that was actually accessible and fair. We clarified vague language in the covenants, including defining extended periods as anything over 60 days for temporary storage situations. We also established a community advisory committee, allowing residents who weren't on the board to have input on major decisions. The HOA became less about enforcement and more about actually serving the community. Barbara mostly disappeared from neighborhood life. She still lived there, but she kept to herself. I saw her occasionally at the grocery store or driving through the neighborhood, but she never acknowledged me. I heard through the grapevine that she was considering selling her house and moving to a different community. My business continued to thrive. Word got around in contractor circles about what had happened. and I actually gained several new clients who appreciated that I stood up for doing things the right way even when it was difficult. The plywood was long gone, delivered to my client and transformed into a beautiful outdoor kitchen setup. But I kept one sheet as a memento, mounted on the wall of my garage workshop. Jenny made a little plaque for it that read, "Reminder to stand up for what's right." 6 months after the election, we held a neighborhood barbecue at the clubhouse, the first community event the HOA had organized in years. Over 200 residents showed up. Kids played in the pool while adults grilled burgers and hot dogs. People who'd lived 3 houses apart for years met for the first time and became friends. Patricia stood up on a small stage we'd set up and made a short speech. This is what an HOA should be about. Not fines and violations, but building community, bringing people together. Making our neighborhood a better place to live, not through rigid enforcement, but through genuine care for our neighbors. Everyone applauded. I looked around at the happy faces, the kids laughing, the sense of actual community that had been missing for so long. All of this because I'd refused to back down over some plywood sheets and a ridiculous fine. Frank came over with a beer for me. "You know, when you first started going door to door with that petition, I thought you were crazy. Way too much effort over a couple $100. But look at what came out of it. I know. I didn't expect any of this. I just wanted them to admit they were wrong about the storage violation. Well, you got that and a whole lot more. The neighborhood's actually enjoyable now. I've met more neighbors in the past 6 months than in the 5 years I lived here before." Jenny joined us, carrying a plate of food. "You boys talking about how Samuel saved the neighborhood again." "I didn't save anything," I protested. "It was a group effort. A lot of people stepped up." "But you started it," she said. "You were the one willing to stand up and fight when everyone else was just complaining quietly. That matters." Maybe she was right. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say this isn't right and refuse to back down. One person willing to organize and fight, even when it's difficult and uncertain and potentially expensive. The sun was setting over the Scottsdale mountains, casting long shadows across the clubhouse patio. Children were still playing in the pool, their laughter echoing in the warm evening air. Neighbors were talking and laughing, making plans for future gatherings. This was what a community should feel like. I thought about the building inspector, Robert Chen, who'd said I was following code better than most. In a way, that had become my philosophy for the HOA board too. We weren't just following the rules. We were trying to exceed expectations, to build something better than what was required. The HOA wasn't perfect now. We still had disagreements and difficult decisions. Some residents still pushed back on any enforcement at all, while others thought we should be stricter about certain issues. But we'd found a balance, a middle ground between chaos and authoritarian control. 3 months later, I was doing a routine check of our HOA's financial records when I noticed something strange. There were several expense reports from the previous board that didn't quite add up. Payment to vendors I'd never heard of, receipts that seemed inflated, and some transactions that had no documentation at all. I spent a weekend digging deeper, cross-referencing everything against our bank statements and vendor records. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 2 years, approximately $47,000 in HOA funds were unaccounted for. I brought this to an emergency board meeting the following Monday. We went through everything together, and the conclusion was unavoidable. Someone on the previous board had been embezzling from the HOA, and the most likely suspect was Barbara Henderson, who'd had sole signing authority on the HOA accounts for over a year. "This is serious," Patricia said, looking pale. "This is criminal fraud." "We need to bring this to the police," I said, "and we should probably hire a forensic accountant to do a proper audit." The board voted unanimously to take both steps. We hired an accounting firm that specialized in fraud investigation, and I personally went to the Scottsdale Police Department to file a report. Detective Lisa Morgan took my statement. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s who seemed genuinely interested in the case. "HOA fraud is more common than people think," she said as she reviewed the documents I'd brought. "Usually it's small amounts that fly under the radar. 47,000 is significant. We'll definitely investigate." The forensic audit took 3 weeks. The accountants traced every suspicious transaction, interviewed former vendors, and reconstructed the financial history of the HOA. Their report was damning. Barbara Henderson had systematically embezzled funds over a 24-month period using several different methods. She'd created fake vendor invoices for services never performed, inflated legitimate expenses and pocketed the difference, and made unauthorized cash withdrawals using HOA debit cards. The total amount stolen was actually closer to $62,000 once they found all the hidden transactions. The police moved quickly once they had the forensic evidence. Detective Morgan contacted me one afternoon in mid-September to let me know they were executing a search warrant on Barbara's home and would be making an arrest. "I wanted to give you a heads up since you're the one who brought this to our attention," she said. "We'll also need you to be available to testify if this goes to trial." "Of course. Whatever you need." The arrest happened the next morning. I wasn't there, but Frank witnessed it from his house and called me immediately. "You should have seen it," he said, sounding shocked despite knowing it was coming. 3 police cars, detectives in suits, the whole thing. They walked her out in handcuffs. She was yelling about how this was a witch hunt and she'd done nothing wrong. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By that evening, everyone knew about the arrest. The local news even picked up the story. "Former HOA president arrested for embezzlement" ran on the 10 o'clock broadcast, complete with footage of Barbara's house and interviews with residents. I felt conflicted about the whole thing. Yes, she'd been a terrible HOA president who'd made people's lives difficult with her petty enforcement. But I'd never wanted to see her arrested and facing potential prison time. Still, stealing $62,000 from your neighbors wasn't a minor offense. The legal process moved forward. Barbara was charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and theft. She hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to argue that the transactions were legitimate expenses that had simply been poorly documented. But the forensic evidence was too strong. The fake vendors didn't exist. The inflated invoices were obviously manipulated, and several of the cash withdrawals had been made at casinos and luxury retailers. In December, faced with overwhelming evidence, Barbara's attorney negotiated a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts of felony embezzlement in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, ordered to pay full restitution of $62,000 plus interest, and required to perform 500 hours of community service after her release. I attended the sentencing hearing. Barbara looked nothing like the confident, aggressive woman who'd issued me that first violation notice about the plywood. She was pale and thin, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood up and apologized. "I know what I did was wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "I let power go to my head and I made terrible choices. I hurt people in my community who trusted me. I'm sorry." It seemed genuine, though it was hard to tell. The judge wasn't particularly sympathetic, noting that Barbara had abused a position of trust and stolen from her neighbors over an extended period of time. The sentence was appropriate given the severity of the crimes. After the hearing, Detective Morgan approached me in the courthouse hallway. "I wanted to thank you for bringing this to our attention," she said. "Most people don't follow up on financial irregularities like this, especially in HOAs. They just chalk it up to poor bookkeeping and move on. Your diligence led to a real criminal being held accountable." "I just did what anyone should do when they discover a crime," I said. "You'd be surprised how few people actually do that," she replied. In the months that followed, our neighborhood continued to heal and improve. The restitution money from Barbara, which she'd been paying from the sale of her house, went back into the HOA's accounts. We used some of it to make long overdue improvements to the clubhouse and pool area that had been neglected while Barbara was diverting funds. I served on the HOA board for 2 full years before deciding not to run for re-election. I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do: reform the enforcement practices, improve transparency, and build an actual sense of community in Meadowbrook Heights. It was time to let someone else take the reins while I focused more on my business and family. On my last day as a board member, Patricia organized a small appreciation gathering at the clubhouse. About 60 residents showed up, which was touching. People shared stories about how things had changed for the better, how they felt more connected to their neighbors, and how the HOA actually served them now instead of just punishing them. Dorothy, the older woman who'd been hit with the driveway fine, gave me a big hug. "You changed my life," she said. "I can afford to stay in my home now, and I'm not constantly afraid of getting another fine I can't pay. Thank you." Frank raised a glass to toast. "To Samuel Atwood, the man who started a revolution over some plywood sheets and ended up transforming our entire community, and somehow managed to get a corrupt HOA president sent to prison along the way. Not a bad couple of years' work." Everyone laughed and applauded. Jenny squeezed my hand, smiling proudly. "Speech," someone called out. I stood up, feeling suddenly self-conscious. I don't think I really have a speech prepared. But I'll say this. When I got that first violation notice about storing plywood, I was just frustrated about what seemed like a pointless fine. I had no idea it would lead to all of this. The petition, the election, discovering the embezzlement, all of it. I paused, gathering my thoughts. But I learned something important through this whole experience. Systems only work when people are willing to stand up and fight for what's right, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. If I just paid that first $250 fine and moved on, Barbara would probably still be running this HOA into the ground and stealing from all of us. Sometimes you have to be willing to fight, not just for yourself, but for your community. More applause. I sat back down, feeling a mix of pride and relief. It was finally over. The fight that had started with a simple stack of plywood sheets had concluded with real, lasting change. A few weeks later, I was in my garage workshop when I noticed that memorial plywood sheet mounted on the wall, the one I'd kept as a reminder. The plaque Jenny had made still read, "Reminder to stand up for what's right." I thought about adding another line to it but decided against it. The message was perfect as it was. Simple, direct, and true. My phone rang. It was a potential new client wanting to discuss a major renovation project. As I talked through the details and scheduled a site visit, I found myself smiling. Life had returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. I was back to focusing on my business, spending time with Jenny, and enjoying living in a neighborhood that actually felt like a community. The story could have ended so differently. I could have paid that first fine and avoided all the conflict, stress, and uncertainty. But then nothing would have changed. Barbara would have continued her petty tyranny, the embezzlement would have continued, and our neighborhood would still be a place where people lived in fear of their own HOA. Instead, by standing up for what was right, by refusing to back down even when things got difficult, we transformed everything. Not just for me, but for hundreds of families in Meadowbrook Heights. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to fight. One person willing to say, this isn't right, and then actually do something about it. One person willing to store some plywood sheets properly, get them approved by a building inspector, and then refuse to be bullied into paying an unjust fine. That person happened to be me. But it could have been anyone. It should be anyone who sees injustice and has the courage to stand against it. The plywood was long gone, used up in projects and daily work. But the lesson remained, mounted on my garage wall as a permanent reminder. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Because you never know what positive changes might flow from that one moment of courage. Our neighborhood was better now. Our HOA actually served its purpose instead of abusing its power. And somewhere in the Arizona state prison system, a former HOA president was learning that actions have consequences, and that stealing from your neighbors will eventually catch up with you. As for me, I was just a contractor who'd stored some plywood sheets and refused to accept an unjust fine. But sometimes that's all it takes to change the world, or at least your little corner of it. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest transformations. I went back to work, feeling satisfied with how everything had turned out. The workshop was organized, my tools were ready, and I had a full schedule of projects ahead. Life was good in Meadowbrook Heights, better than it had been in years. And it all started with some properly stored plywood sheets and a $250 fine that I refused to pay. Funny how life works sometimes. The smallest moments can become the biggest turning points if you're willing to stand your ground and fight for what's right.